So many demos.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining our webinar today with Julie Lerman. My name is Daniel, and I'm with Pluralsight, and I'm helping to host today's webinar, helping with the housekeeping and whatnot. To get things started, I just wanted to call out a few housekeeping items. Number one, a lot of people ask, are we recording this? And we are recording this. So if you have signed up to watch this via Zoom, you will receive an email in the next day or two with a link to watch the recorded version. If you are joining us on one of our social media platforms, right now we're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, etc. If you're joining us there, then once this is done, you could rewatch it right there. Share it with a friend, etc. So hopefully that takes care of your rewatching needs or sharing needs. Another housekeeping item, we are going to be doing Q&A. Julie is kind enough to tackle your questions at the end of our presentation today. So depending on where you're joining us, please submit those questions and we will pass them along to Julie. We'd definitely encourage you, if you have a question that's, at the beginning of our presentation, just ask that question right then. Don't wait till the end, because typically we end up getting a lot. And so it's good to be kind of at the front of the queue rather than at the back of the queue. One other thing, if you run into any issues, like, the audio is not working, etc., just refresh your browser window, or if you're in Zoom, leave and rejoin the presentation. And that usually resolves like 90% of the issues that people run into. And with that, I think that's kind of the gist of the housekeeping. So I'll turn it over to Julie.
Thanks, Daniel. Hi, everybody. By the way, I am wearing some Pluralsight swag, but you can't see it, so you have to try to step up a little higher there. There's a Pluralsight Live shirt and Pluralsight sweatshirt. So yeah, I don't have Pluralsight swag earrings, but that's all that would show, I guess, unless I had a hat. Anyway, so I'm so happy to be doing this. I've already been thinking, oh my gosh, how am I going to get everything? I want to show a million things in a short period of time, but I'll just have to have some self-control, because if you've know me, I just like to get down into the weeds and see how things are working and explain how things are working. So I'm actually in the middle of updating my Getting Started with Entity Framework Core course from focusing on 3.1 to focusing on 5. So I've been playing with Entity Framework Core 5 for a while. And today I'm going to show you some of Entity Framework Core 5, and also talk to you just about what to expect. So a little bit of an agenda here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about where we've come from and EF Core 5's release timeline. I'm going to take a broad look at the changes, improvements and bug fixes, things like that. One of the things that I think a lot of people are going to be excited about is that we've got some more parity with EF6 features. Some big features that we've been waiting for a while are finally in EF Core 5, and as well as features that we've been asking for a long time that are finally there, that weren't even in the earlier versions of EF6. I'm going to talk a little bit about moving from EF Core 3 to EF Core 5 and breaking changes. And I'll just tell you right away, it's a very small number of breaking changes, and most of them are pretty minimal and edge cases. So if you went from 2 to 3 and that was like the breaking changes edition, it is not like that at all anymore. So if I have time to just show you, just look, it just works, I'll do that. And then at the end, we'll do Q&A. So Entity Framework Core, I just want to set the stage. Entity Framework has been around for 12 years now, 12 years, and even longer than that, because they were, creating it and evolving it. It was first released in 2008. So it is pretty important technology to Microsoft, not a fly-by-night thing. And it's, they are continuously really investing in it. That was what EF Core 3 was, really this big investment, which is why there were so many breaking changes. It was just getting it ready so it would be able to handle lots of forward movement in the future. So EF Core 5 is coming out, not should be. EF Core 5 is actually feature complete. They're really working on the documentation now, just polishing things up and thinking about EF Core 6. So there is a conference called .NET Conf. So it's at .NETconf.com. It's a 3-day conference that Microsoft, actually the .NET community puts on, but there's a lot of Microsoft involvement in there. And they will actually be launching N8 Framework Core 5 along with .NET 5 and ASP.NET Core 5. And that's all going to happen in a couple of weeks. So I think the first date, so it's from the 10th, 11th, and 12th. So I think the release date will be the 10th, but we're already at release candidate 2, and it is feature complete. I think there's a tiny, like a couple of issues. Like I think there's 2 issues that are tagged for EF Core 5 that haven't been closed yet, 2. And it already has a go live license. So it is solid and ready to use now. This is an important thing to understand about EF Core 5. So it is now requiring that you have .NET Standard 2.1 in whatever application, whatever software you're running EF Core in. So that could be .NET 5. It could be .NET Core 3.1, and also all these other platforms that we've been using, the cross-platform stuff on for these years of .NET Core and everything, and EF Core and ASP.NET Core. So it'll run on all of those things, but it's really important to understand this is focused on 2.1. EF Core 3 ran on .NET Standard 2.0, and what else runs on .NET Standard 2.0 is the .NET Framework. But the .NET Framework itself, and I don't mean .NET, and I don't mean .NET Core, but .NET Framework. .NET Framework does not run on .NET Standard 2.1. So EF Core 5 will not run in your old .NET Framework apps. But if those are WinForms apps or WPF apps, don't forget that those now support, they moved to .NET Core 3. So they're on .NET Standard 2.1, and they're moving forward. So you can still bring, if you want to use EF Core 5, you can still bring those apps into a newer version of .NET and then be able to use EF Core 5. But that's just a really important thing, because that's a big change for EF Core, that it's not, you can't use it with .NET Framework anymore. So are you ready? We're going to go over all these new features. Just kidding. Notice that I said new features include this list. There are so many new features in EF Core 5. And I have this handy little link to open up. You can go into the EF Core docs and see, a lot of what these changes are. They're organized by the different previews and the RC. So you can see a lot of what that list is. Of course, you can always find that stuff in GitHub. And in addition to all of those new features, so many new features, there are also almost 400 issues that were referenced as, tagged as bugs, 400 that were closed for working across EF Core 5. So they have done so much work. It's amazing. And so I can't show you all of these new features. So what I've done was just picked some of the ones that were most interesting to me. So some of them fall into the category of N8 Framework 6 features that have finally come forward, but I don't want you to assume that they're exactly the same, because of course they're better. They work better and they're easier to use than they were with EF6. There's one new feature that we've been waiting for since the beginning of EF time. I mean, since 2008, which is to be able to filter and sort on the include method when you're eager loading. So I'm going to show you that because it's so cool. And then there's a bunch of other things that I'm personally grateful for. So I'm going to show you those along the way. I'm not going to read these lists because you're going to see them. So I'm going to flip over to Visual Studio 2019. Notice up here that it says preview. So that's still 2019, but starting with the release that's not a preview is version 2019 version 7 point something or other. So the set that starts with version 8 point something or other, those are the previews. And the reason I'm using preview is because even though you can use EF Core 5 with .NET Core 3, I want to use the latest and greatest, of course. So I'm using it with .NET 5. And so all the most stable support for .NET 5 currently is with this preview of Visual Studio 29 version 8 point whatever. That will also come out of preview when everything gets released on November 10th. So actually, I should first show you just an easier view of what my classes are that I'm working with, my domain model. So this is not the data model or the database model. This is just my classes. So I'm keeping it kind of simple. I have a person class and I have an address class. The person has also a list of addresses, a property that's a list of addresses, and address has a property that's a list of person types. I call it residence. That sets up a many-to-many relationship between person and address. So you probably saw many-to-many on my list of EF6 parity, but better. And also I have a type called wildlife sighting. So the address has a list of wildlife sightings. And then I also have some inheritance going on here. Maybe you saw TPT on my list. So I'm going to use all of that. TPT stands for table per type. But those of you who've been waiting for that to come back from EF6, you probably knew exactly what I meant. So that's what my model looks like. And scary sighting just is a way to also describe the experience of the person who had the scary wildlife sighting. Now you see, this is not a current picture because the leaves have all gone, but this is my front yard. I do live out in the country up in the mountains in Vermont, in the northeast part of the US. So yeah, we do have some wildlife. Don't look at that. I went too far. Okay, so I've got everything split up. If you've seen my courses, I like to make even the introductory demos somewhat realistic by not piling everything into one project. So I have, my user interface in this EF Core 5 console app. I've got a domain library where I have my classes. There's no need to expose all that extra stuff. So there's my address, my person, the scary wildlife sightings, which inherit from wildlife sighting. Okay, and I also have a context class set up, right? Like, all the stuff that we're used to seeing. So the first thing I want to show you in this context class is this log2 method here. So we had really simple logging in EF6, a simple method for logging. And then in EF Core, what happened with logging was it got integrated with some much more intelligent logging capabilities that are built into .NET Core. But then we had to do a lot of setup to make that work, and they refined it a little more in EF Core 2. But for EF Core 5, it has just gotten so much simpler. We don't have to create factory classes and all that kind of stuff. All we have to do now is there's this nice little log2 method on the options builder. And I'm using that in on configuring, but you can also use that if you're using ASP.NET Core, when you're in the startup file and you're configuring, so you can use it there as well. I'm just doing simple because it's I'm using a console app. So log2 takes a target, and in this case, I'm using a delegate to say, since it's a console app, just to use the write line method of console, just to spit it out to the console. And then if you've used logging already in EF Core, you might be familiar with these ways of filtering what gets logged. So in this case, I'm passing in an array of DB logger categories and just saying the only thing that I want to see in the logs is database commands. And I'm also using a log level. Log level is tied to the logging API, not the EF Core part. And it's just about the level of detail that's spit out. So I just want information to come out. So that is really, really nice. And you'll see that in a few minutes when I actually start running things. Now let's take a look at that many-to-many again. So I already showed you that person has a list of addresses, and address has a list of person types, which I happen to be calling residents. So in EF6, this was all we needed to do to express a many-to-many relationship. But Entity Framework did a lot of magic in the background to make that work, so that Entity Framework understood, and as does Entity Framework Core now, understood that even though I don't have a join entity here to link them, it understands that there needs to be one in the database. So that's the convention, to presume that there's this join entity in the join table in the database, and so it takes that into account when it's writing queries, when it's materializing records, etc. And of course, doing updates and inserts as well. So we get that magic again. In EF Core 1 and EF Core 2, we were forced to, this wasn't worked out yet, so we were forced to have an actual entity in between, and then there were all these, these one-to-many relationships, and anytime we expressed anything about that relationship from end to end, we always had to reference that, go through that navigation, whether we were writing a query or building up a graph and saving data, doing things like that. So that was not a lot of fun to do, but it was a way to make it work. So the team said, okay, that there is a way to do that. Let's focus on some more important things. The other important thing we had to do in that older scenario was, in the DB context, we had to let it know that the join table that it's going to infer should have a composed primary key, and that would be composed of the keys of each of the tables that it was joining. So I just want to show you, even in this commented out code, there's nothing about that. I just don't want to confuse you with that. So just trust me, there's nothing in here. I'm not telling Entity Framework Core anything extra about creating that many-to-many relationship. So what I'll do is I'll do a migration, so you can see that in the migration how it's creating that table. Before I do the migration, I want to get back to the fact that I'm using .NET 5, and it's going to make something a little simpler, actually a lot simpler, because it's pretty confusing for a lot of people, including myself. When I had that in the EF Core 2 and EF Core 3, when I'm separating out my data access project, this is where all my Entity Framework stuff is, and my executable is, in a different project. In order to run migrations, Entity Framework needed access to some way to execute, to run some code. So we always had this dependency on the console. So this would, normally I would have made this, it's a class library, and I would have based it on .NET Standard, and .NET Standard is not executable. So then we had to put all of the Entity Framework Core tooling references inside of console, and always have to have some kind of executable available to do that. The alternative was to take your class library and make it either multi-target or just target EF Core, a .NET Core app, And then all of a sudden it's like, well, now I'm targeting app, I'm not targeting library, and I don't like doing that. So, I mean, there was ways to deal with it, but it was kind of annoying. The nice thing is, and not just annoying, it was definitely led to confusion. So the nice thing about using .NET 5 is that you don't have all of those targets separated. It's just one target, Net 5.0. So whether I'm building a class library or an exe, so take a look at the CS proj for the console, I'm still targeting .NET 5.0, but the output type is executable. Okay, so with my data library project, it's not. So what's nice about this for using migrations and other tools that depend on this, for very, very good example, the EF Core power tools, right? The tools that allow you to create, visualize your model, do reverse engineering, things like that. That's an extension written by MVP, and he does this all in his free time, even though he has a full-time job. He's so awesome. I feel like I'm introducing somebody on the dating game, but it's Eric Eilskov Jensen. And, so he actually took that project over from the team when it was the EF Core, NA Framework Power Tools, and now he's made it into this. So I just always want to give him a huge shout out, because it's just such a great thing, and a big labor of love. And it's open source, so you can contribute to it too. Anyway, so that also had that kind of a dependency. So that problem goes away. So now, if I clear that out, if I'm in Package Manager console and I want to do migrations, now it's still, the migrations still depend on wherever I'm doing it from, has to be the startup project, right? So this will work. There's another way to do it, but I just want to show you, I've got the default. So the Package Manager project is pointing to the data library, and my startup project is the data library. And so I can add migration, many to many. And Daniel saw me making some very last minute changes before we started, so didn't break anything. So there's the migration. And what I wanted to show you is, so this is the first migration. So it's creating the addresses table, it's creating the people table, and my wildlife settings, and here, address person. So it inferred the join table that allows the many-to-many relationship between person and address. And again, just using its conventions, it inferred the names of the two columns that'll be the foreign keys for that table that will create that. So, so it just knows how to do it. And what's really nice is with EF6, it seems like a lot of magic, right? There's a lot of logic going on in the background. In EF6, there was a lot of magic also that enabled this, actually EF through EF6. But that magic was so magical that if you couldn't really muck with it, right? And so now it might look like magic, but there's actually a lot of solid logic behind how it's working. And because of the way that logic is designed, there are some more capabilities. I just have to keep an eye on the time, because I could end up only talking about many-to-many because it's so fascinating to me. So just keep moving forward. So I want to show you, I'm going to update the database from here. And the reason is I want to show you something else that is a great improvement. Notice that I'm targeting SQL Server. Okay, so usually when you're letting Entity Framework migrate a database, when it's actually creating the database for the first time, that usually takes quite a while. And there was actually, there's a parameter in the connection string that you can use that makes it faster. And I never remember off the top of my head what it is, the name of that. And I actually did not know about it. All these years, I have not been benefiting from that. And I've been like waiting and waiting and waiting for, SQL Server to create. So the person responsible for the SQL client actually built that in. So watch, once this is built, how quickly the database got created. Oh, what did I do? I messed with the demos. That's what I did. What did I do? I messed with the demos. Dun, 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 dun. What is it unhappy about? Oh, probably the database already exists. Yeah, because I was practicing, right? So I'll just drop database and then recreate it. This feature has been around for a while. So, okay, drop database. Now look how quickly the database gets updated. I'm like, please work this time. Yes, it worked this time. So that was actually a lot faster. I think it took longer for Visual Studio to display the log of what was going on than it actually did to create it. The other thing I want to point out was I did not put the dash verbose attribute after I said update database. So update database wasn't by default giving me these logs. This logging that I'm seeing is actually coming from the logs, the fact that I said log2. So that's there. So now I want to work with them. Actually, we should always see the database, right? Refresh. Tables. So there's the address person table that it created, right? No magic. It's all real. So if I go over to my program file, I'm going to, first of all, even though I migrated the database, I'm going to let program delete and recreate the database as I run the demos. And since it's so fast, who cares, right? So what I'm going to do is just show you not only did Entity Framework know how to create the database, but it actually can work with this many-to-many relationship also, again, without any help. So all I'm doing here is I have seeded the database. So there's some seed data there. I've seeded the database, so I'm going to pull back 2 people and 2 addresses, and then I'm going to add both addresses to one person, and then I'm going to add both addresses to the other person, right? So I don't have to navigate through anything. I'm just talking about the 2 ends and letting Entity Framework figure out the rest. Then I'll save the changes. And then, actually, I'll not stop there. And then after I've done that, then I'm going to run. So there you're seeing an insert working. And now I'm going to do a query. And again, I'm not going to have to worry about what's in between people and addresses. I'm just going to include addresses, and Entity Framework will figure out the rest. So I'll just run that. Oh, this is, yeah. I'm going to set this startup project back to EF Core 5 console. And so the first thing you saw flash by was the result of ensure deleted and ensure created. Then I cleared the console. So if I scroll up, so there's the, selecting the first 2 people. There, selecting the first 2 people, then I'm selecting the first 2 addresses, and then I did the insert. This is not new to EF Core 5, but I hit the threshold of 4 objects in that save changes command, so that all got batched. Am I right? Yes, that all got batched. Now I did the query, and it just, created one SQL statement to bring back all of that data across the address person table. And then my console write line was just, write out the name of the first person and both of the addresses that came back. So after the data was materialized, this is what I got back. Now, I originally had myself, Jeremy Lickness, who's the program manager of data, and Bryson Arthur as my seed data people. But when I was running this demo, I was like, yeah, that kind of looks weird that I'm saying that I live in the same household as Jeremy. So I just put husband of Julie as my second person instead. Anyway, so there's, many to many just working. But wait, there's more. I keep checking the time because I'm still on many-to-many, but this is actually the really cool part of many-to-many. A lot of times when we've created those many-to-many relationships back in Entity Framework, not Core, one of the downsides was it works, many-to-many would always work as long as you didn't have extra data, if you didn't want extra data to be stored. Right. And if you did, then we were back to having to have a join entity and navigating through that join entity for everything that you need to do. So you didn't get the benefit of many-to-many anymore. So with EF Core 5, that same scenario, hey, we want to track some more data, not just the two IDs of what we're joining. And by the way, I didn't know this. That's referred to as payload data. I learned that because Arthur Vickers, who's one of the engineers on the team, kept talking about payload data. I was like, what is he talking about? Oh, that's how, the database nerds refer to that additional data. Anyway, so what we're talking about here is adding in payload data. The way it works, I'm going to flip back to my beautiful slides. Hey, how did we get back there? Woo. Okay, here. Okay, so we were here. Now what I want to do is in this many-to-many relationship, I also want to keep track of when the person moved into the address. Okay, so in EF6, if I wanted to do that, I screwed up everything because by having the additional join entity in between, I had to change all my code to navigate through it. So here's a representation of that additional join entity. So it's resident, I'm calling it resident. It's got the ID of the address, the ID of the person, and then that payload data. And I'm just using one, but you can have multiple properties if you want. So what's interesting about EF Core 5, though, if I was doing this in Entity Framework 6, I would no longer have this many-to-many relationship between person and address. I'd have a many-to-one from person to resident, and then a many-to-one from address to resident. And I would always have to do that. But with EF Core 5, we can have this entity that tracks whatever extra payload data we want, but we still have the benefit of this direct many-to-many relationship. So how does that work? Oh, that's why I got back to that view. Make this easy. Oh, look, there's my resident class. All I have to do is include it in the project. So there's my resident class. Notice that it has no knowledge of the person type or the address type. I haven't changed the address. I haven't changed the person. They have no knowledge of that resident type, right? Because my code and my domain doesn't change, right? What changes is that I just have to tell Entity Framework about that navigation, about that join entity that I have. So my code doesn't think of it as a join entity, but Entity Framework will. So even with that resident there right now, Entity Framework doesn't even know that it exists because nothing's connecting to it. So it can't be discovered through any of the other classes. And it will continue to infer that join between the address and the person. So what you need to do is say, hey, Entity Framework, you know that relationship between person and address? Well, I want to tell you a little bit more about it now. So this code here, all that's doing is that first part. Hey, you know that relationship you know about? So I'm not creating anything new. I'm just expressing the relationship so that I can add some more information. Here's the new part. I'm saying when you think about that many-to-many relationship, do so using this new entity called resident, the resident type. And I want you to understand that resident has a one-to-many relationship with address and a one-to-many relationship with person. So I don't have to know about this. My code doesn't have to know about this. Entity Framework will take care of it because I've given it these instructions. So it's going to pay attention to this information when it's inferring the database schema if you're doing migrations, when it's building SQL, when it's doing inserts and updates and queries, and when it's dealing with results and materializing objects from the results. So there's one more bit that I'm doing in here, and that's just to keep the demo simple. So the simplest way of dealing with a payload is to let the database be responsible for populating that date. So I don't have to also add code in to put that moved in date in there. That would be the logical next step for building your software, right? But I'm just doing, this is the simplest thing. So this is not even anything new. This kind of configuration has been around for quite a long time. So, I'm talking about the resident and saying, oh, and by the way, that moved in date property, when you map it to the database, I just want you to tell the database that it should define a default value for that column, and that's get date, right? That's actually using SQL's function get date. So that's how I'm doing that. So can you tell I'm talking really fast? I'm starting to run out of breath, as though I'm walking on my treadmill. But okay. I just have to do that, right? So I can breathe again. So what I'm going to do then is I'm going to run this again. Okay, but instead this time, I promise you I'll get to some of the other demos. We've got so much time. This was the really intense one. So this time I'm going to run this again, and I'll delete and recreate the database again. So the stuff that we just created will be gone. I'm going to run that same exact insert many-to-many, but this time, instead of querying back the many-to-many, I'm just going to query the residence so we can see that. So I just have to uncomment that code because it wasn't going to compile before. Now I don't have a DB set for residence, so all I'm doing is just using the set method because the context is aware of residence. So I'm just saying a set of resident, query that, and then write out to the console the person ID, the address ID, and the moved in date. So the first thing I need to do though is update my schema. So I'm going to migrate the database. Even though I'm really, my application is really going to be using this for the demos, I want you to see the migration. So we're going to migrate the database. So add migration, M2M payload. And there's a reason I want you to see this. Okay. I'm not going to keep switching the startup project back and forth, so I'll just use the attribute for doing the parameter for that. So startup is data library, because data library is where I have a reference to the entity framework core tools. So first thing to notice is this bright yellow highlighted notification. Operation was scaffolded that might result in the loss of data. Please look at your migration. That's what we're going to do. Look at the first thing it's doing. It's dropping the address person table. What? That's my join table that might already have data in it, right? The next thing it's doing is creating a new table named resident. So what's going on here is the first time I define the many-to-many, and I just let Entity Framework Core infer, using its conventions, infer what the name of the table was. It inferred the name address person because one type was address and the other type was person. Now I'm mapping the resident type to whatever that join table is going to be. So the convention for that is, well, the table is going to be the same name. I'm not expressing the name of that table anywhere. I haven't told it what table name to use. So by default, it's going to use the name of the class. So it thinks it needs to use the name of the resident class. Well, if we're just noodling around and we haven't gone into production yet or anything, that wouldn't be a bad thing. But I don't want to do that. What I want to do is say, no, use the join table that already exists. So I'm going to remove this migration. I haven't, you're all yelling, don't forget startup data library. Okay. Now do you know why I talk so slowly when I do my courses? Actually, one of the reasons for that is because not everybody speaks English as a first language, and I don't speak all those other languages. So I figure if I speak slowly enough, you'll understand me. And for those of you who think I talk too slow, all you have to do is go fast. Put it on, go twice as fast. Talk fast, Julie. So now I'm going to make a little change in here. Change is actually already there. I just have to uncomment it. And I'm just saying, hey, when you are building that table that resident is mapping to, give it the name address person, right? So now it will go to the same table that exists now. So I'll migrate it again. And this time it's not dropping and recreating the table, which is great. It is dropping the foreign key, then renaming the columns, because remember the default columns from inferring the table were residence ID and addresses ID, but now it's using the properties in resident. So the new name would be this for one column, and the new name is address ID for the other column. That's why it had to drop the foreign keys. Then it rebuilds the foreign keys down here. So that's, I'm not going to worry about that. But that's something else you can configure in people context just to keep everything in line. But the difference between this and the drop table is this, you won't lose data because of this. But if you have other applications, reports or anything that are dependent on those names, then you want to make sure that, you know, if you're doing this in production, you want to keep everything in line. So you can just use a configuration to fix that. So the only real big thing that's happening here is it's adding the column moved in date. So if I now, by running this, obviously it's, I'm not going to update the database in migrations because I'm going to delete it and recreate it in the code anyway. So remember, I'm going to insert the many-to-many data. This, those two addresses, by the way, my husband and I only own one house. Those two addresses, where is it? Query there, right? So I'm going to run this where I grab two people from my database, I grab two addresses, and then I build that join just like I did before. And then this time I'm going to just query the residence. So I'll Control F5, cross my fingers. That's always an important part of it. Okay, so I'm not going to worry too much about this, just to show you querying the residence that it created from that data. There's the person ID, the address ID, and the date moved in, right? The date moved in is, again, the date that the database created. So that's a really, really cool, like just the beginnings of this extra and really important capability that many-to-many has right now. And the not only the fact that we can store that payload data, but the fact that we can add the payload data without messing up our code. I didn't have to change how any of this code works, right? I'm still navigating directly from one end to the other. Okay, so a whole, like I said, I could do a whole course on many-to-many. Don't hold me to it. So filtered include, this is another really cool, wonderful feature we've been waiting for a very long time. So we've never been able to, if we're doing eager loading, we've never been able to filter the related data that we're pulling in. It's an all or nothing thing. So if I wanted to query for people and all of their addresses, my only option was to always get all of their addresses. If I didn't want all the addresses, I just wanted some of them, then you just couldn't use eager loading, but you could use projections to do that. But eager loading is a lot easier to work with. So I'm just demonstrating here, and I'm using tags. Tags came with EF Core 2, so that just is going to take this text that I'm passing into tag with and add that to the query. It's add it to the query as a comment on the query. So I'm using tags just so that when we look at the SQL, we'll know what we're looking at. So the first thing I'm doing is saying, give me all the addresses along with, make that go away. Give me all the addresses along with their wildlife sightings. Actually, I'm just getting the first address along with all of its wildlife sightings. Okay. The next one I'm doing, oh, this is another new feature. I love this feature. It is great for demoing and testing. It is not a feature that you want to put in your production code. But what this does is it clears the change tracker so that I can just use the same tracker for all of these queries. If I didn't clear the tracker out, all of the, all of this data that I just queried would still be here when I did this query, right? So I would see all the data. The change tracker would have everything, even though I was only asking the database for this stuff. So I'm just saying, instead of instantiating a whole new context, change tracker.clear just clears out everything the change tracker knows. So it's like a brand new context. And again, just going to say this very clearly, don't use it in production. Okay. Julie said, and the team will tell you that too, or they might, ifs, ands, or buts because of client, if you're creating something client side or whatever, maybe not so bad, but this for me is for demos and testing. Anyway, so I'm clearing that out. Then I'm doing an include. Again, I'm getting the first or default address, and I'm including wildlife sightings. And notice this where is now on the navigation, where the description has the word bear in it. Oh, bears. Yes, I live in the woods in Vermont. There are bears. Now I'm doing a third one where I'm filtering and sorting. So I'm saying include wildlife sightings, order by the wildlife sighting description, where the description does not contain the word bear. Okay, so just double check. I am just running filtered include. And again, what you just saw fly by was delete the database and recreate the database. So I just had to scroll up for my 3 queries. And remember I'm using log2, right? To get all these logs, just log2 was so easy and outputting to the console and filtering on just the commands. Anyway, so here are the wildlife sightings. The first address was 1 Main, Control M. And there are all the wildlife settings, right? Because there's the tag right there, no filter sort. So see, it just puts the double hash in front of it. So double dash in front of it. So it doesn't really become part of what's executing in the query. But those aren't just for the logs. This is saying this is going to the database. So if you were looking at this in some other profiler, you would still see these query tags, which is nice. So anyway, there's the first, the output of the first one where I'm not doing any filtering. So, and I just want to say that we really did have a bear with 3 baby cubs in my neighborhood in the woods. And they must have been, somebody was around recently because my neighbor's garbage got completely trashed and dragged out into the woods a couple of days ago. I saw the bear from a distance once. I never got to see the cubs, although I don't think if I was in the woods, I would want to see the cubs because that might make the mother kind of mad. But my neighbors saw them from like their deck. One day it was 1 cub. Another day somebody said 2 cubs. And then finally someone's like, oh my God, there's 3 cubs. They're so cute. I never got to see them. Anyway, so that's the first one. Yeah, this is what I do when I've got a limited amount of time. So filter, here's the second filter, right? And all I got back was ones where the description contained the word bear. And here's where I did filtering and sorting, not on bear, and it sorted alphabetically by seeing garter snake and squirrel. I want to leave you a few minutes for questions. What else do I have here? So what I'll do is, just explain some of these things, but I won't run them. And maybe I'll record them like on you and put them on YouTube or something like that so you can see, because I worked hard to create them all. So another really interesting one is called split query, and this split queries for include. So not just for include, but when you're doing an include, there was the NA framework team has gone back and forth on this with like EF Core 2. They were breaking it apart into two separate commands that were going up. And that, oh gosh, let me remember the reason. I think the reason for splitting into two separate commands was for performance. And don't hold me for, because it went back and forth. So I'm just a little confused at the moment. But they had split it. It used to go in one command, like a left join, and then they split it into two commands to make the performance better. But what they found was there were some cases where the results were inconsistent because of the way the query was being built. So for EF Core 3, they went back to putting it into a single query because it was more important to have consistent results than to eke out that performance. But, then we get into these situations, not here, of course, but when you've got a lot of data and something complicated, where, performance is important also. So what they've done now is given us the option. So the default is that the query will all go as one query. But then if you use this new method as split query, which you would use if, you're profiling your database, you say, okay, the performance is better, and my split query is giving me back the results that I should be getting, right? So you've done some profiling and that you can confidently use this as split query, then it will split the query up. So that's you have agency over doing that, but you have to do that explicitly. The next thing I want to point out is that we now have table per type support. So if we look, I have the scary wildlife sightings that inherit from wildlife sightings, the scary ones. So by default, Entity Framework Core supports everything being in a single, let me just view data, in a single database. That's table per hierarchy. The entire hierarchy of the inheritance is stored in one table. And so NA Framework adds a discriminator column, and then all of the columns that represent the derived data also go in there. So now if you were to, I'm going back over here to the context, if you were to explicitly specify another table name for that derived type, then you'll get table per type. So scary sightings will be in its own table. So you won't have the discriminator column and the extra data in the main table. They'll be in their own table. And that's enough to explain without demonstrating it. I'm going to flip over to one other project just to show you another important feature for all of you who are, where is it? I can't see because of the large text. Let me just pull it up over here. So what happens if we go a little long, Daniel? And everybody's going to stay.
I think I'm fine with it. If you're fine with it, I am,
and
there'll be a lot of complaints.
Sorry, not too long.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so I'm not quickly finding the example I want to bring up. So I think I have not actually ever used Blazor before. I know, right? So I think there's a lot of people who are very excited about Blazor. And Blazor, there was a complication with using Entity Framework and Blazor, which there was a pattern around that. So the complication, let me just describe it quickly. When we use web apps, it's really important not to have a long running context. And when you're using ASP.NET Core, you can set up a dependency injection in the startup file, in your startup file. And that dependency injection will scoped, it will allow you to create a DB context for a scope of a specific request. So it's scoped to requests. So you have short running a short running context, a new one gets spun up for every request. And that's, that's the way it should be. Well, Blazor is not a server-side application. It's running on the client side. So there is no request scope, right? So how do we deal with that, right? So we want it, everybody's used to doing this putting add DB context through dependency injection in startup, but that wasn't working because there was no scope. So the DB context wasn't getting created. So the way to do that was to create a factory, an IDB context factory that would that you could pass into your controller, and then in the controller, so the factory would I'll show you what the resolution was for EF Core 5 to get around the manual effort, the manual solution. So there was a solution, but it was manual. So now we have a solution that's built into Entity Framework Core, which is this add DB context factory extension. So the beauty of using the dependency injection for this is in one place, we're defining which provider to use, what connection string to use, and maybe other parameters like log2, right? Or some other parameters that you might want your DB context to have every single time. So this allows us to pass a DB context factory in once, and it's okay for the factory to be long running because the factory isn't tracking anything. So, isn't tracking your entities or anything like that. So the way this works now is in Blazor, that's, the most natural place to be using this. So here I'm injecting the IDB context factory, and this will be understood because of this. It will understand how to sort that out because I've said, add DB context factory into my services, do it for my context, my DB context called context, and whenever you instantiate it, use SQLite provider, and here's the connection string, right? So all of that is understood. And so it's being injected here, and then on the fly, anytime I need to use it. So here I'm doing an operation, a particular operation, and I'm going to be adding and then saving changes. So this is the moment at which I want to instantiate my short-lived context. So I use the DB factory that got passed in and call create DB context. So that will spin up my new DB context using, SQLite. It knows it's for the context, and it knows the connection string, right? Because that all comes from the DB factory. So if you're using Blazor and you've struggled with this, you'll recognize what's going on here and what problem it's solving. If you've never used Blazor before, like me, I had to kind of understand what the problem was before I could understand what this solution is about. So that is the last demo I'll show you. And I just want to talk a little bit about Entity Framework Core 3. When you see this PowerPoint presentation, by the way, I did show some different ways of using the logs. So, there's with the console write line is this first example here where I'm passing in the delegate. Here I'm using a delegate for a stream writer, but I have to create the stream writer in advance. Here I'm using a Lambda to set this out to the debugger. So write line on debug. Another thing on this slide I would like to point out for those of you who've missed the ability to just have a query in hand in your code and call toQueryString on that query. Before we had any kind of logging in any framework core back in EF Core 1, that's back. There's a lot of people who are excited about that. And there's no criticism to them, but now I'm like, but I have all this logging, so I haven't thought of a reason why I need to use that, but it's still something people are really excited about. So now let's talk a little bit about EF Core 3 to EF Core 5. So mentioned this before, if you went from EF Core 2 to EF Core 3, that was a really big deal. And a framework team used that version as kind of a level set to say, we really need to make NA Framework Core so solid that we're going to be able to build upon it for years. So they did a lot of low-level changes to it that caused a lot of breaking changes. They were very clear about them all, very transparent. And, it was all listed on the website, and you could see everything about those changes, why they needed to do it, what the behavior used to be, what it is now, what it looks like, and even mitigations if you don't want, if there was a way to avoid dealing with that break and change. There was a lot of that in Entity Framework Core 3. A lot of people are worried that it's going to happen again. That was really, I won't call it a 100-year flood, which we say in Vermont when you get one of those huge floods that, so huge it only happens every 100 years. I don't think any Framework Core is going to be around for 100 years. But that was a big deal and not something they plan on doing often. And hopefully, hopefully something like that won't happen for a long time. So Entity Framework Core 5 does not have that amount of breaking changes. As a matter of fact, there's like a dozen breaking changes. Most of them are low impact. There's two that are notable. One is if you have a required relationship, the is required method changes how it works a little bit, because we now have the ability to specify a requirement in both directions. We could only specify it in one direction before, from the child to the parent, so you couldn't have an orphan. And am I saying that right? Yes, that a child could not exist without a parent record. And so is required only meant one thing. There's only one thing it could ever mean. But now they have enabled the ability to say, well, you can't have a parent without a child either. So I don't exist anymore because I don't have any children. So it can mean two things. So it is just important where you put it when you're expressing it in your model. And if you use defining queries, there's a change to how they work a little bit. But if you look at this list, the breaking changes in EF Core 5, there are only two that are medium. The rest are low, kind of edge cases. So, compare that to EF Core 3. So definitely be aware of them, because they might have, some effect on your code, but it's just not the big breaking changes. And I took, some sample apps that I wrote and just switched them from EF Core 3 to EF Core 5, and they just work, right? But I didn't have a lot of complicated stuff in there. Now what the team is working on, since NA Framework Core is feature complete, they're focused on enhancing the documentation, and they are, putting in more examples of using Entity Framework Core in different platforms. They've reorganized the documentation. So they're really focused on enhancing the documentation, which is why I don't write books anymore. The documentation is getting better and better. And I think it's interesting to note that even though there is a whole team, a whole docs team at Microsoft, they can only do so much. And the NA Framework Core team is actually responsible for their documentation. The benefit, the downside of that is, they got to focus on creating Entity Framework Core. So sometimes the documentation takes a while to come around. But the upside is they know Entity Framework Core really, really well. They know what the guidance is. They know what you should and shouldn't do, what best, better practices, et cetera. So you'll see all that in there. There we go. That's it. I'm so sorry I took more time. Sorry to those who, anybody who had to leave, didn't get their questions answered, et cetera. But I'm grateful that I got to show you all the things I wanted to show you. So let's do this.
Still have some time for some questions then?
I'm happy to do them if people are still here.
I think people are, and I've seen in the chat, everyone's like, keep going, we'll stay here all day. Okay. So I think we'll be okay there.
All
If it
right.
works for you, I can just start asking some of these questions.
And go ahead.
Okay. Yep. Dan in the Zoom chat asked, when will UWP be compatible with EF Core 5?
And Julie in the Zoom chat says, I don't know. It's still TBD. I don't know. I haven't been paying attention to it. Sorry.
Okay.
There may be a definitive answer somewhere though, right? Just because I don't know it. So, we could ask the team on Twitter or something like that.
Cool. Next question, Chris asks.
No, EF7, no.
Okay, you saw that one already.
And I'll tell you why. There's a couple of reasons, and this question comes up a lot, right? So you hear my personal reaction, like, no. I like having it core because it really differentiates it between what it is now and what it used to be. Okay. And it will also, it also is nice to have it aligning with .NET 5. They did this once before when we went from the very first version of EF Entity Framework, which wasn't called an Entity Framework. They never named something one. They just name it the name, right? It was Entity Framework. And then we went from Entity Framework to Entity Framework 4. There was no 2, there was no 3. And the reason they did that was because .NET Framework 4 was coming out along with .NET Framework 4. So they're like, it'll make life easier if they all have the same number, so we know that they go together. So that's why it's 5, .NET 5. Why it's not .NET Core, why it's not EF Core 4 versus EF Core 5, but also why it's not EF7. And they tried EF7 once, remember? That was what it was originally named. EF Core was originally named before it was officially released. They were calling it EF7. Then they changed everything to Core, including ASP.NET. Okay, next, Richard.
Yep. How easy is it to change the name of the M2M table?
It's so easy that all you have to use is the to table. Well, actually, I showed that. Let me see if I can just. Oh, I'm not even in the right thing. I'm wondering if that question is in the scenario where you're not using an explicit class that I used for the payload. So I haven't tried to do that when I haven't put in my join entity, like that resident class. I'm trying to just get back over here. So I don't know, I can't imagine it would be too hard, but I don't know if you still need to add in that class in order to, where was it? Yeah. I don't know. I wonder if you could just do to table here. No, you can't. I don't know. I haven't tried it. I don't know how easy or hard you think that would be. I don't know if it would require having that explicit join entity, even if I don't have the payload property in it, and then still doing this and then doing that, right? Because Entity Framework won't understand this unless it has this, right? So that might be the way it has to work. And again, I'm assuming your question is if you haven't had a need to add payload data and therefore had a need to add this extra class, it might be necessary to add that extra class in order to do this mapping. That's just my guess. There's another thing I guess you could do is just write in the no, it would, no, forget it. I didn't, just rewind. So that's what I think. I don't know. Why always use left join? We have issues with that. Sorry, getting ahead of you.
No, that's fine. You want to just tackle that one?
I don't know. This is why I let Entity Framework write my queries for me. Right? Because that's the kind of stuff I would leave to a DBA. I am not an expert at writing SQL.
Do you want to read David's question? I feel like it's a little longer. It might be easier for you to read it than for me to read it to you.
Okay, how would an entity such as person know about a payload property such as move-in date when the code only knows about the relationship in context of another entity address, especially when you want to explicitly set. So, okay, so what David is asking is, remember, I took the easy way out of dealing with that property, that moved in date property, by saying, I'm just going to let the database fulfill it right now. So there are definitely more advanced patterns to use when you want to explicitly interact with those other payload properties. So I just didn't show them. And as a matter of fact, I believe that Arthur Vickers, who is probably the most knowledgeable, I think he's certainly the one who got really excited when he was explaining the ins and outs and all the details of many to many to me. And I believe he's he's definitely built up some demos because he showed them to me. He may even have shown those demos in one of the EF core stand-ups. And they may end up going into the documentation as well. So there's definitely more advanced ways to work with that payload data. So I'm not going to answer how, except with the kind of cheesy answer of by using some more advanced patterns. And we will be learning about those. Like, through the documentation or from the NH Framework core team, or, when I do something a little more advanced, maybe in an article or something. Okay, next.
I'm going to pass along a question from Facebook from Hassan. What is the difference between DB context factory and repo pattern? And if you want to pass, we can just pass and move on to the next one.
Let me just think for a minute. So the DB context factory is there for the purpose of instantiating a DB context. So it is not, it's not a DB set. A DB set is a repository. So it's not for, collecting up and adding and inserting and, even with DB context, it doesn't do any of that stuff. It's just a factory for its sole job is to instantiate the DB context for you.
Cool. I'm also going to pass along one from LinkedIn from Vendim. This might have already been answered. So if so, apologize. But they ask, so the migration script doesn't check if the database /tables exist. How will that work when you want to make updates to add more volume to the table? Does that question make sense?
Yes.
I feel like I read that like it.
That's okay.
Weird, but
yeah, well, that's not what you do. Not what you do. It's okay. You did your job of reading really, really well.
Thank you.
But I don't expect you to understand what that meant. But I understood what it meant. So migrations has an idempotent parameter that you can use. You wouldn't use it to update database. You would use it if you were letting migrations create SQL script. So you would use the idempotent parameter, and then everything's like, does this, was this run yet? Was this migration run yet? Does this, does this exist? If not, create it, etc. So that's one way to do that with migrations.
Great.
I hope that answers the question.
I'm sure that did. How many more minutes do you have? Looks like we have a few more questions in Zoom.
I will stay as long as everybody else is good with it. I'm unless, not 2 hours, not 100 questions. Let's just keep going.
Okay, great. Wilson's question, what about .like?
.like still exists, and that .like is an EF. Did I use that? Oh no, I thought I used it. It's because I used it in my getting started course. So .like comes with, it's not there, but it comes with Entity Framework EF functions. like I think it's part of the DB functions. So like if I have, is it DB functions? Or maybe it's there. Maybe I just have to, I'm just looking for a place I can just toss it in. Anyway, so there's, it exists as part of DB functions and it gets translated. I'm just thinking if I could just quickly open up one of my demos. No, that's why we're here for so long. Let me just say, there, .like exists. It came in EF Core 2, and it comes with like, it's in the EF namespace, so EF.like, and that gets so that way you can pass in parameters that look just like how you would write it in T-SQL. But dot contains and some of the others you may have already noticed in my code, that also will translate things into like statements. So I think that hopefully that's a sufficient answer. If not, watch my Getting Started course. It's in there.
Awesome. Bruno's question, can I use split query with link to SQL?
No, split. I haven't looked at link to SQL in a really, really long time. I don't even think it's been expanded or advanced in a long time. But anyway, split query is specifically in the Entity Framework APIs. Sorry about that. Sorry for the bad news.
Steve, would you please address best practices for porting an EF6 class library to EF Core 5? Start with a new project or update the existing project? How should I preserve migrations?
I would, EF Core is very different from EF6. A lot of the paradigms are the same, the DB context and migrations, the ideas of how things work are very much the same. But there are a lot of differences, different methods, different behaviors of methods that existed before. So it wasn't meant to be backwards compatible by any means. And I'm sure you already know that. So the NA Framework team does in the documentation have some basic guidance for migrating from EF6 to EF Core. I don't know if it's specific to EF Core 5, but I think just to EF Core, just the basic concepts. I start with a new project or updating an existing project. I think, unless it's really complex, I would be tempted to try just updating the existing project and just chasing down all of the not exceptions, but errors that you're going to get. That's the best quick guidance I can get. And that aligns with Beverly's question, is there a conversion option from EF6 to EF Core 5? The answer to that is unfortunately just no, because there really are, EF Core is just a completely different code base. So it's not just a conversion, but like I just said, if you've got, you don't have super complex stuff going on with EF Core, your EF6 code, you might be able to just move it forward. Another thing I think is really important when you're doing those kind of migrations is if you have your logic separated out, broken up. Where is my brain? Separation of concerns, right? So if you have you saw that in my projects, right? I keep my database, my data logic separate from my domain logic, separate from my UI logic, right? And the more you do that, the easier it is to do those kinds of conversions and migrations, right? Because things aren't as tangled up. Next.
Giovanni's question, do you know if EF Core Power Tools...
Wait a minute. Read the first two words. Come on.
Oh, sorry. I apologize. Great presentation.
Thank you. Sorry.
Do you know if EF Core Power Tools will be updated to be compatible with EF Core 5?
They are. Eric has been working hard on that. As a matter of fact, that's all. I've been using them with EF Core 5. Now, granted, I Oh, I already am back in there. I've only been using where's my Solution Explorer? I've only been using my favorite part of that tool, which is the migration, no, data library, EF Core Power Tools, add a diagram. It's actually easier even because, because I'm in .NET 5, I don't have all those problems with multi-targeting. The other really cool thing is if you don't have the DGML editor installed as part of your Visual Studio install, when you install the Power Tools, it'll install that. So I don't know if you are there and you just saw that am I still sharing my screen? That I just ran EF Core Power Tools on my EF Core 5 library in .NET 5 and it just boom worked. Isn't that beautiful? Yay, Eric. Okay, next. Sorry.
Samson, if you make changes to this migration, like change a table name, would it remember those changes when you create another migration?
That's actually a really intelligent question. An interesting question, because normally when you let Entity Framework create the migrations, then it updates the snapshot of the model, and then the next migration is depends on that model. It's like what changed since that model. And that is exactly why when I started, when I was answering the question about changing the table name of the many to many, I was about to say, oh, maybe you could just go in the migration and change it. And then I thought, wait, no, that's not good, because that's not going to carry forward. So I'm looking at Chris's thing. So that's my best answer to that question.
Okay. Another question from Samson. He's double dipping a little. It's okay. Is Xamarin.Forms supported? I see Xamarin.Android/iOS/Mac, but Forms is not listed, I think is what he's trying to say.
I don't know. This is really embarrassing, but I don't know anything about Xamarin. So I don't know if those things if Forms is inherently included when in those other things. So I'm just not the right person to answer that question. So now I'm going to have to go find out.
No worries.
Okay.
Ben asked a question. He asked if there's an EF Core or EF5 course coming out from Pluralsight.
Yeah. So what I'm doing right now is I'm taking the Getting Started course that was for EF Core 3.1, and I'm updating it. I have to re-record everything, within the new Visual Studio, and so re-recording all the demos and changing things where things change. So it's kind of a big project. But I'm not going to, I'm about 2/3 of the way through, but there's no way I'm going to release it before the 10th of November. And because there's things that I can't do for the course until after the actual release has done. So I'm going to try to get everything else done before the 10th. And then after it gets released, then I'm going to try to record some of the other stuff. So I would say, it's not going to be like next year. Right. So I would hope, by the end of this year, maybe mid-December or something like that.
Awesome. Okay. I see one more question. Thanziel asks, will the included entity be change tracked if the parent is queried with as no tracking?
No, because the whole query, it's the query is as no tracking query. It's not the as no tracking doesn't apply to specific entities in the query. It's all or nothing. So anything in the query or nothing in the query. So the answer is the quick answer is no, but there's the explanation. Like either you're tracking the results of the query or not tracking the results.
Awesome. I think you did it. I think you got through all the questions.
Whew. All right. Great questions. Thanks everybody for hanging out too. I could just go on and on and on. Yeah, which is, not really the best thing in the world, but I'm really glad everybody was patient and hung out, and also that I got to answer all those questions. It was awesome.
Yeah, I think everyone's really appreciative, definitely. I've seen several questions come through about getting access to the code. So
Yes.
if I think what we'll do is we'll email a link to the recording and the deck and the code all kind of in one bundle so everyone can have access to all of that.
Actually, it will be, we'll do that, but I just want to say it's in a private repository right now, but I'll push up all the changes. I'll push up all the changes soon. And then I'll make the repository public. So let me, over here, I'm going to just get you the repository so you can at least see the name. My repositories. Oh, there it is. Easy. What? It's called EF Core 5 Webinar Demo. So I haven't pushed up the changes to it in a little bit, and I might clean it up and squash it down and do things like that. But this is what it will be, where it will be, as well as packaged up with whatever Daniel's gonna put out there.
Awesome. I know everyone will appreciate that.
Yeah.
One other thing, I dropped it into the chat, but if you want to sign up for email reminders of other Pluralsight webinars, you can go to the URL pluralsight.watch and it will take you to a form that you can fill out there. We've got some good ones coming up and maybe even another one with Julie somewhere on the horizon. I think that we might have to plan something else. What do you think, Julie?
A many-to-many bonanza.
Yeah, let's do it. And with that, thank you so much, everyone, again, for joining us. Watch out for that email. And